Welcome back to RealHouseDIY. Working on the new addition. Drywall is finished. I'm going to show you all the tips I know in a nice flat wall with a joint compound with less sanding. Tools I'm typically using for the joint compound: got a small knife, a little bit bigger knife, the really long knife, and the 90°. Those are for all their inside corners. There are much longer knives that you can get rather than this one. This size is about 12 inch. I found that's more than enough for drywalling a single room. When you're done, wash and dry your tools. These can develop surface rust, so it's best to dry those off. Use a step ladder for where you need to reach the ceiling. You'll need your joint compound. There's many different types that you can use. I always use all-purpose, just one thing that I need to buy, and that's it. I even use it for the skim coat on the ceiling. And with this bucket, it's already mixed for you. You might find there's a little bit of water on top that you can pour off or mix in. And even if I'm just doing a small job, I always get the large bucket because this seals really well and it doesn't get moldy compared to the small buckets that are hard to get the lid on. You want your mesh tape, or if you prefer the paper tape. And I do use the reinforced paper tape for outside corners. I'm using the mesh tape everywhere else. I found that this has never failed on me, whereas the paper tape, it sometimes does fail, even when you think you've got it perfect. I'd suggest don't try to be fancy in cutting the mesh tape with your knife. You'll mess it up and you won't get the last strand and it will all peel off. Just use a pair of scissors. So I've just about run out of my mesh tape, the regular kind. It's by fiber tape, by the way. I do have leftover roll of the mold resistant tape. You can use this on your regular drywall. So I'm going to finish up the ceiling with that. Something I didn't have in this project is an outside corner, but the outside corner is where I would use the steel reinforced paper tape. And you can see that that has two strips of steel, and you fold that, and that will give you a nice strong outside corner. And you can bump into that with a laundry basket or whatever, and less chance of that edge of the wall getting damaged. The problem with paper tape, of course, you need to really mud the inside first, and then when you put this in, make sure it's really well set into that mud, and then you're gonna mud the outside. You can't have any air bubbles. You know, there's lots of room for this to fail, where you're gonna end up with bubbling, peeling, even cracking over at these edges. So that's why I always prefer to use the mesh tape, but unfortunately for outside corners, this does end up being easier to use. You just need to spend a lot of extra time. Make sure you have a ton of mud in the joint before you put this tape down, and really press it in and make sure there's no air bubbles. And then before you start your joint compound, you want to vacuum, get any of that drywall dust from the cutting all cleaned up. You don't want any of that dust landing in your joint compound. Here's after one coat. I don't try to go perfect on the first coat. So an example, you have a dry bit of something that was stuck in the joint compound. Drag through it, don't try to make it perfect. This, after it dries, just sand this bit off. The second coat will cover that up just fine. You might get this here where you used your long knife and you picked it up right there. That's okay too. Again, very easy to sand that off after. Don't try to make it perfect. You might even make it worse and drag more of these dry things through or whatever. So here's after one coat on the screw. It's not perfectly flat yet. That's gonna need a second, even a third coat. Same for this joint and the corner joints. This is good for a first coat. After it's all done, you're gonna wanna shine a light on it at an angle. You'll be able to see if there's any high spots. You'll notice that closed room such as this, you finished all the joint compound. It's gonna be really humid in here. You can use a fan to help dry it faster. You might want to open the windows. So you might do like I've been doing here, do it in steps. just a little bit here or one entire wall at a time. It'll dry faster and be less humid than doing the entire room at once. When it's time to start sanding, you want to clear everything out of here. You don't want to have to be vacuuming drywall dust off of all these extra things that you have in here. So, completely minimal. You're going to want your sanding sponges or whatever you like to use. If you like to use the pole with the sander for the ceiling, for example. But I'm just using sanding sponge, and I like to wear swim goggles. This will 100% keep all the dust out of your eyes. The dust really bothers my eyes. And you want to wear a respirator. This drywall dust and joint compound dust, when you're sanding it, it's very airborne, floats around an awful lot, and you don't want to breathe that in. After you're done sanding everything, let the dust settle for a day or two, vacuum it all up. Vacuum the walls, vacuum the ceiling. You want to check, make sure you didn't miss any spots. You might need to re-sand. An important step you don't want to mess up when you're all done sanding and the walls are all clean. You don't want to just go and paint with a top coat paint. You want to get an actual primer sealer. It's usually white. You can get a gray color too. Paint all that. Because if you just go and put a top coat on this now, this is going to be a slightly different shade of color versus the drywall to the joint compound. You need to have that primer sealer coat. Something you might not think of, this edge around the window, same for the door. If you're planning trim around the window, which you probably are, maybe you're not though, you don't even need to coat these screws. I might just do one simple coat over this because your trim is just going to cover all this up. When you're doing your joint compound, if you're using a brand new bucket, that's best. Here I'm using up a half full bucket from a previous job maybe a year ago, which is getting to the point where you just want to throw this away. There are lots of dry bits on the sides here that end up falling inside. Those dry pieces will drag through your joint and cause more work for you to get rid of those and sand them out, recoat. So ideally, you want to use a brand new bucket of mud. But since I had this, I don't want to just throw this away. I'll reuse it. So there's a joint I'm working on now between two panels using the mesh, which has sticky back. Just start at the top, flat it down nice and straight. Cut it with a pair of scissors at the bottom where the indent starts on either panel. So the goal is to get that nice and flush. You don't have to feather that out at all to get this to be perfectly flat. The first coat I like to do very thin, just focus on really smushing the joint compound into this crack here. It's going to dry and shrink anyway, so you're going to need a second coat anyway, possibly even a third coat. A lot of people say that the paper tape is easier for the corner. You can fold it and make a perfect 90-degree angle. And they say, it's difficult to fold the mesh tape. I'm going to show you how to do the mesh tape now. It's extremely easy, no bubbles or anything like people say. I'm not sure what the problem is. Just start, get stuck at the top there, and you're going to focus on just one side right now. Go all the way down to the floor, just that one side sticking down. Make sure that one side is going down nice and straight. Flatten it all the way up. I'm going to press in just a little bit here to get that 90-degree. Now it's a nice flat 90-degree fold there. It's flat on the right side. And then you flatten down the left side. There's no bubbles in that. Not sure why people have trouble with it. And now you can very easily squeeze all the mud into that joint. Not worry about having to do mud first, then paper tape, then more mud. And what I'm going to use is this blade here just to get some on right side, left side, and then the 90-degree corner trowel to go straight down, smushing into the joint. Now I've spent some time just smushing in the joint compound into that crack through the mesh tape with a small knife, and use this 90-degree knife, and you'll see it's actually not 90 degrees. It's a little more. That allows you to really press it in, and then you can get a nice smooth coat down. I'll probably do a second coat, but that'll be a lot less work feathering out joint compound at the edges if you try to go for closer to 90 degrees to start with. And down at the bottom here, I end up having mud going out too far for the sides of the 90-degree to work well. Rather than having to sand all that off, I just took my long blade and took that off the wall straight to the corner. And you can see, you can still see the tape through there. It's really just the mud getting into that crack. Then the second coat just be to cover up the tape, and we'll need very little feathering after that to get it nice and flat. Let me show you a different couple examples here. This wall, this is going to get a built-in bench and bookshelf all the way up. So as you can see, I went pretty heavy on all these coats. Yeah, you can even have a ridge here. It's still drying. You can see the thicker joint compound in the middle here is still drying. It's still wet, that darker color. Now, if this were a visible wall, there's a couple different options, and you went this thick, you'd either have to really feather this out, or you'd end up with a lot of sanding. Then over here on this side of the wall, this is going to stay exposed. There will be some trim to this door opening here, but I went extremely light on this coat. You can even still see the mesh tape through there. And that's like a perfectly flat 90-degree angle. This is getting a second coat, but it's going to need very, very little feathering to get that to look nice and flat. So completely up to you. You know, if you want to go over a little bit on these two flat pieces of drywall coming in on this flat edge, and do that extra work to sand that off, or try to just get this nice and flat to begin with. Or in these corners, if this was an exposed part of the wall, if you want to do a little bit more work on the joint compound to get this, minimal, and then you have less sanding work, less feathering work to do, that's fine. If you want to do the fast joint compound, let it dry, do a little bit more feathering or more sanding, that's completely up to you. I still have ways to do to get to the ceiling. I'm going to finish the ceiling as well before I go and sand everything. But I'm going to finish the corners with the corner tool. I'll get the mesh tape on these joints on the ceiling. I'll do one coat on the screws and these joints with the wide blade here. And then after that dries, I'm going to use the wide blade again for a skim coat. Basically what I'll do is I'll load up this blade with the smaller one and coat it. Try to get it nice and thin. And you just go nice and light passes, smooth it out. Then when you get it light enough to need minimal sanding, you're all done. Then you'll be ready to sand. When you're sanding, have the entire room closed off. Drywall dust from sanding, even if you're wet sanding, it's going to be floating everywhere. Here's an example of an outside corner I did years ago. As you can see, using the paper reinforced tape, multiple coats of joint compound, feather it out. You can get that looking nice and smooth, spend a lot of extra time on that, and it will come out nice. I'm working on the ceiling. It's a bit faster. I like to do it this way. Load up the long knife. A fast, easy coat there. Do the same for the corners and the screws. After that dries, I'll do a second coat and then a final skim coat on the entire ceiling. On these ceiling corners, I like to load up the top edge of the long blade first. This is just for really squishing in the joint compound into the crack there. And then I go back with the corner trowel. So again, similar to the walls, it's just the first coat. You can go pretty light on the first coat. Just go around, knock down the high spots with the long blade. And for the screws, you'll see that there's a small indent now where the first coat of joint compound dried and shrunk a little bit. So we get the second coat on. So second coat is now finished on this first wall. I'll want to wait for that to dry before I put the second coat on the adjacent walls for these corners. What I can actually do is move over to the opposite wall and do that one next for the second coat. Wait for both to dry and then do these two opposite walls. And don't forget, for these edges where you have the two tapered edges coming in from two different pieces of drywall, you don't want to feather those out, you just want that to be flat. But for the corners, you do want to feather this out several inches with each coat. And this 12-inch blade that I have here, this one you'll notice has a slight curve to it. That curve, you want that bump facing out. For this flat joint, where you have the two tapered ends coming together, this will become perfectly flat, so you'll push some pressure down as you do the joint compound, and that'll flatten the blade, and it will get that perfectly flat across that joint. And then pretty much everywhere else where you use this, you'll use it flipped around the opposite way, so the two edges won't be digging in. So you'll feather that out with the curved ends up away from the wall. And with this blade, I like to load up the joint compound on the edge I'm going to be using. So I'm just working on this side of the wall for this corner. So I start off pretty thick and then scrape away most of it as I feather it out. Between coats, you want to scrape off any of these high spots. And I'll keep the next coat nice and flat. Our second coat is dried. You can see it's this lighter shade that's a little bit further away from the first coat. So now we're working on the third coat. And again, just feathering out a couple more inches further. So with each additional coat, we focus on doing as light a coat as possible. That means it's going to be less work to finish it, and it's going to be flatter and smoother. Last step after everything's all dry, use my sanding sponge. And it should just need a very light sanding to get it to be smooth. It's already flat, already looks pretty good. So this is just going to make it nice and smooth and fix any imperfections, such as, can hardly see it, this spot right here. Some light marks from the last pass that I just made. I'll leave that, it's fine. I'll just need a light sanding to fix it. When you're sanding, don't forget to wear respirator, goggles, fully close off the room. If it's like this room has all doors and windows it can close. Otherwise, seal it off with plastic. There'll be less cleanup because the dust when you sand this does make a mess. It will, most of it will appear that it's falling straight down, but a lot of it is actually going to be floating through the air. And these spots for the drywall screws, I only did 2 coats. That's all this one needs, but still after you sand, in case you went a little bit too deep on the screws, you can look at it from the side, shine a light on it if you need to, and you'll be able to see if that needs a third coat or not. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.